Now, good players will know that Bronya is a very flexible and very strong character across the board, very solid support if you are planning to make her a reroll target. But the real true advanced and best players know exactly when she isn't very useful. And in this video, we're covering her best teams, but I also will be giving a lot of commentary on when some other supports might be better than her as well. And if you're interested, do watch till the end because I have tons of tips for you guys as well. Now let's start off first with the very important narrative on Bronya herself in terms of what makes her so good and why is everyone talking about her. There are two main reasons, and the first is her skill action advance by 100%. What this means is you push no matter how slow the unit is up to the start of the line. Even if you have a very slow unit, for example if we see this chart here where we have the slowest units in Honkai Star Rail, it doesn't matter how slow they go, action advance immediately moves them to the top of the line. This is very useful because when you push the units to the front, you can essentially invest just in their offensive stats. Of course, later on you go, if you want to have more damage coming from multiple sources, Bronya's single turn advance might not be as useful as a character like, for example, Asta, who if you are already speed tuning your whole team, Asta just boosts all of them up to be a bit quicker as well. A lot of people are focusing mostly on her skill in terms of the action advance, but they forget that the ultimate boosts the crit damage and attack of the whole party by a very substantial amount. This makes Bronya slightly more flexible than a character like Tingyun, who is more of like a single target focus buffing hyper carry kind of style. Bronya has that single target buffing ability. With a strategic sense, you can choose who you want to buff in her skill, but also with the whole entire team crit damage buff, attack buff, you get a bit more holistic. She does become a bit more flexible versus like a sole hyper carry team, but also is able to fit in teams where damage output comes from various sources. Let's talk about the free to play comp where everyone has access to these characters, and we will slowly add more gacha as we go along this video. So the first character that I want to talk about is a character like Danheng. Danheng benefits from a single target buff because he allows himself to get a bit more wind penetration as well. So Bronya buffs him up, and he generally wants to also have high crit rate early on because if he crits, he speeds down the enemy. So Bronya combos very well with him to give him that crit damage, since he will generally run quite high crit rate in the early game already as well, giving him good attack, speed buffs and stuff. Although he doesn't really need the action advance, it does help him move quicker, and the faster your DPS moves, the more output they do as well. I think AoE damage dealer will work really well here, who doesn't really require a dedicated speed up from Bronya. So in my mind, I think a character like Herta will be really strong because Herta doesn't really care about moving faster. She is mostly focusing on her follow-up attacks. And if you have Danheng like bringing characters down to 50%, she procs her passive, very strong in terms of like a free-to-play team to do quite a lot of damage overall. Bronya enables many teams already, and you have a lot of options if you start with Bronya, and that's why a lot of people are very attracted to this character. And in the last slot, very simply, you can also run Natasha or even Fire MC. You could even run, if you wanted to, March 7 as well to, for example, give a bit more shielding to a certain character, or direct aggro to maybe Bronya herself. So if you direct aggro to Bronya, she acts as like your tank plus your buffer, and in that case she's a very cheap unit to build because you can just invest in just HP gear for her and a bit of speed so that she can move a bit faster, or energy restoration of that sorts, and just focus her as like a pseudo tank build in that sense together with March 7. As you can see, Bronya is one of the rare characters that can utilize every single free to play character, and she allows you a lot of options as you pull more characters later on as well. And as we add more gacha into the mix, the first character I want to talk about is Susang. When Susang is replacing Danheng in this slot, what she offers is much more independent play because she has a self speed up as well as damage increases when the target is weakness broken. This allows Bronya to stop dedicating her buffs towards the Hunt class characters in the slot number 2 here, and instead focus on the AoE damage dealing class in slot 3. You have many options in terms of your third slot, and if you run a comp of Bronya as well as Susang, you are actually implying that you want to be buffing your third slot unit. In that sense, I wouldn't recommend Herta since she doesn't really benefit from the speed buffs Bronya offers, but instead I'll be pushing up Qingque, Serval into the higher categories in terms of a 4-star team that will benefit more from Bronya's buffs. Other characters that also will benefit, of course, is a character like Hook. But Hook is more similar to Danheng because Hook really likes action advance and moving faster. Very slow character in general, but does a lot of single target damage. Okay, at this point, before we dive into like the whale comp, let's talk a bit about Asta and as well as Tingyun. So a lot of people are wondering, if you have Bronya, is it impossible to play Esta and Tingyun? I think this is going to be a very nice segue into the whale team comp, because when you run a double attack buffer in the team, for example, you have Tingyun and Bronya, or perhaps you have Esta and Bronya in the same team, what you are implying is you're actually going to be double buffing a particular hyper carry. You increase the damage output significantly of that target character, and that target character has to be able to carry your whole team, and that is one of the options that you want to do if you're playing a hyper carry team. You might get that damage output much higher, but your utility in terms of using many S tier supports in one particular team might not be the best for most accounts, especially if you're a small spender, or in this case a free to play, as we are indicating in this section here. Now let's talk about the whale comp. In terms of the whale comp, we are going to talk about anything that is more than one 5-star character like Bronya plus another one. Although there are lucky free to plays here and there, but generally speaking, I think that anything that is more than one 5-star is relatively hard to get, especially if you are in your first week of gameplay only. Well, works really well with Bronya, especially if you're planning to play on a speed differential kind of team. Weld offers pretty decent AoE damage and on his own, and he does benefit from Bronya's ultimate in terms of attack buff and crit damage buff if you can get his crit rate high as well. In that case, in this 3rd and 4th slot, I'll be perhaps even running a character like maybe you could run Dunheng as a single target damage dealer. You can run Susang as a damage dealer as well. I think these two characters will work pretty strongly in terms of synergizing with these 3 units. Your last character, maybe you want to run more of a Fire MC or Natasha in a sense to get that sustain up or a bit more AoE damage and a bit more healing. One thing to know if you're running Natasha in this slot is Natasha is not very fantastic at breaking enemies, and neither is Bronya. So in this sense, you are left with your slot 2 and slot 3 to do a lot of the breaking as well. I think out of all the standard characters, Yanqing probably work the best with Bronya if you have 2 standard characters. And the reason for that is Yanqing has a very high amount of crit rate buffs coming from his passive, and very early on he actually can get very close to 100% crit rate. What this means is his kit will definitely utilize most of Bronya's buffs. I wouldn't be surprised if this is probably one of the meta teams, especially in like the first month or 2 months of Honkai Star Rail, because they are just so efficient together and they output so much damage. One thing to note, of course, is Yanqing does fall off a little bit towards later on when you start getting a lot more gear, and especially when your substats roll into a lot more crit rate. But for the early game and to steamroll content, I do think that Yanqing is an excellent character together with Bronya. In terms of your slot number 3, you want to consider someone that is relatively more independent. You could run someone like Hertao, who is able to capitalize on the situation in terms of the attack buffs that Bronya provides and doesn't really rely on the speed buff. Your last slot should be more of like a defender type unit. You could run March 7 with Bronya to bring her more into the game by utilizing her HP, make her slightly more tanky as well. But of course, you don't get the AoE protection for Yanqing, who wants to keep his passive up. In that case, you could also consider running Fire MC Natasha to get a bit more sustain for overall team, depending on what you're looking for. Himiko, of course, is another character that works really well with Bronya, especially because she's a damage dealer that is relatively slower compared to the many other characters in Honkai Star Rail, one of the lower terms of speed. With the action advance, you push her up and get rid of that downside for her, and she does tremendous amounts of damage with her very excellent base damage as well. With attack buffs, that even compounds even more. I'll put her second to Yanqing just because she doesn't get a lot of crit rate early on, unlike Yanqing, and Bronya's ultimate buffs crit damage. So in order to maximize that, you want to have her built for a little bit more crit rate, and you will build her for a little bit more crit rate. It's just as the game goes by, you will get more gear. Your third slot is really very flexible, but I highly recommend a character like Susang, who's a bit more independent, doesn't really need the dedicated buffs from Bronya, who will generally be buffing Himiko as a main carry. I really like this team. I think this is like a waifu team for most people who are like planning to pull for a waifu team, and perhaps you haven't gotten Zila yet. Maybe you want to consider running this team if you can and have the ability to. The last slot, I think I'll play a character like Natasha here. Of course, you could run Fire MC, but with Himiko's AoE damage and Susang's single target damage, you don't really need that much of fire AoE damage in that sense. And Natasha just allows you to auto battle with the team so much better. You can pretty much like just press auto battle, run into most team comps in the early game. This will just slaughter everything. Of course, it's not cheap to build because most of them are gacha units as well. Alright, now that we've talked about 2 DPS characters that really like Bronya, let's talk about 1 DPS character who doesn't really fully appreciate Bronya. Although Clara is like the slowest unit in the game, she actually works on more of a counter mechanic kind of style. So she doesn't really care too much about attacking herself. Of course she can, and she does more damage from it, but in a sense she doesn't really love it in terms of rely on the attack buffs. What this means is if you are running a team of Bronya and Clara, you actually do still bring a lot of value to Clara in terms of the ultimate as well as the attack bars and crit damage from her ultimate, but her skill then can be dedicated to your slot 3, and it really depends because Clara is really a hybrid between a physical single target and AoE damage. Her splash is not as significant as the other AoE damage dealers, but the versatility that she offers is really strong as well. So in this case, you might consider running Ireland in the 3rd slot here, who generally wants a bit more protection, doesn't like too much damage. Clara offers aggressive aggro drawing. With good amounts of crit damage buff, attack buff, as well as speed up, Ireland will actually be seeing much more play here. It's a very strong character, quite underrated in the current game state, especially it's not very easy to play. For newer players, you might struggle with Ireland a bit, but if you can get around with like building your team around here, I think it's really strong. Ireland generally likes to be at low life, so a healer might be counterintuitive at first. For most cases, Ireland generally prefers a bit of shielding compared to healing because he likes to be at lower life. But one thing to note is when you are action advancing Ireland up by so much already, he will continuously lower his life with his skill, which doesn't eat any skill points. So in that case, Natasha can heal him up, he can use his skill to go and lower life and keep attacking. And he does have a limit of like how low his HP can be before he doesn't really gain any benefits. And this also protects him in terms of the overall team, in terms of any AoE attacks that are coming in. So the thing that Gepard offers is AoE shielding, and Bronya offers a team-wide attack buffing as well as focusing on one character. In this sense, Ireland will be your ideal candidate for your 3rd slot, because why Ireland is when you have an aggro drawer and a very solid thick shield, and you already have such a good action advanced character together with shielding, you really bring a lot out more of Ireland, especially when we talk about in the Clara video already. You could of course run a character like Susang as well, or if you want, you can even run Yanqing, who really likes shielding and relies a lot on Gepard's very thick shield. And with this team, you can then focus on a very versatile last slot where you can really run almost every single AoE attacker in the game. One thing to note is that of course when you run Bailu, you have the AoE team-wide heal. Most characters fit really well with Bronya because you have very solid, for example, Susang, you can run Danheng in this slot for more of a single target burst. Of course, Ireland does a little bit on splash. You of course could run a character like Qingque here, more of an erudition AoE class, because Ireland doesn't take out any skill points, so she can actually be using most of the skill points to proc her Mahjong tile passives as well. Bronya allows you to have much more complex teams, and I would say when you run characters of like higher complexity, for example Ireland and Qingque, really you need to be a little bit more advanced player, and maybe you need to play the game a little bit more and get used to the turn order and skill point gauges and stuff like that. And now let's talk about limited 5 stars, and of course everyone has been wanting and probably eyeing this combo to start off the game as a perfect reroll. This team is just so strong because Zila capitalizes both on her attack bars, her crit damage bars that Bronya provides, doesn't mind moving faster, and that additional buff to help one-shot targets with the damage buff Bronya provides. It brings Zila on early in the game, so at the start if you're not even critting at all, you will find Zila lacking quite a bit compared to maybe a character like Yanqing, who is able to use a lot of Bronya's buffs, whole kit of Bronya's buff much early on. But in this sense, Bronya does mitigate a lot of Zila's early game weaknesses, and that's why a lot of the community feels their synergy together with each other. Of course, the later and later Zila goes into the game, this team also benefits a lot because of Bronya's ultimate ability buffing Zila even more, because it's always like a multiplicative of the crit rate of the target being buffed as well. When you have this team comp, even if you are not buffing in terms of skill on Zila, who already moves very fast on her own, you could even opt for another hyper carry character, for example Jingyuan in this slot. If you run Jingyuan here, Bronya is able to choose between which character you want, and you are able to dish out more AoE damage or single target damage. In that sense, of course, you could have a very solid healer in the last slot. You could run Bailu in the last slot. If you have Bailu, you can run Natasha in the last slot, or even a strong shielder like Gepard or Fire MC if you wanted to as well. Many options in terms of this team because such a solid roster to have in terms of your single target damage. Very expensive team, but definitely pretty strong. Of course, some of you who are looking for Blade could also run Blade in the 3rd slot because Blade does pretty decent AoE damage with his ultimate as well as his skill ability, with his own independent ability of just life stealing up himself, and he's a bit tricky to play. With Bronya, you're able to manipulate his turn order and help him manipulate his HP bar even more. Very very advanced character in terms of the complexity, not recommended for new players, but this team is definitely really strong as well, since you have the option and flexibility to choose whether you want single target or a bit more AoE damage. In this case, your 4th slot is always going to be the same. You can really use any of these 5 characters. They each have their own advantages and disadvantages, as we've covered in other videos already. And if you want to know more about the Harmony class in general and the other team comps that you can play with the other 2 Harmony characters, do check out this video right here which we have done, or maybe you're interested in a Zealer comps and what other team Zealer can play in as well. In that case, thank you so much for watching and see you in the next video.